Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 109 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. It's great to be back behind the microphone today after, probably a couple of months of hiatus of the show. Thank you for your patience and sticking around. I'm very excited to be back today with this terrific discussion with Heather Stang for this episode. And so Heather is the founder of the Mindfulness Grief Institute. She facilitates Awaken, which is a mindfulness-based online grief group. She also offers individual sessions, and she is the host of the Mindfulness Grief Podcast. Even though we recorded this session some months back, I think it's actually a terrific time right now, the new year has just started, to have a listen and consider learning a little bit about mindfulness and perhaps even adopting a mindfulness practice. Some of the topics Heather and I discuss include why she created a guided journal and why it's helpful for grieving people, her 8-step mindfulness and grief process, the physical experiences of grief, instrumental grievers and intuitive grievers, why her first goal in working with grieving people is to help them be able to sleep, what are mindfulness and meditation and their relationship to one another, how mindfulness can help you learn to respond rather than react, and why guided meditation can be helpful, especially if you're not sure how to get started. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Heather Stang. Hey, so before we jump into today's discussion, I wanted to let you guys know that I have just put out a call for submissions for an anthology that I'm putting together. So if you would like to be a part of my next book, now is your chance. So here's what's happening. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that 175,000 kids in the U.S. now have lost a parent or primary caregiver to COVID. Plus, we have all those other kids this year, last year, every year, who lose parents to accidents, suicides, illnesses, and other causes, and all of these kids need our support. And it turns out that one really important way to support those kids is to support their surviving parents. So what I thought I would do is reach out to you guys who are widowed parents, and ask for your best tips and reflections and suggestions for all the widowed parents who are coming after us on this journey. I know each of you has something to share. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to have widowed parenting all figured out yet. You just need to have a tip or two that you think might be helpful to someone who is newer on this path than you are. So particularly if you've been a widowed parent for a little while, or if there's one particular area that you have a suggestion that you found helpful, I would love to hear from you. I am taking submissions until February 15th. I just sent this out. Well, I announced it on TikTok last night. I'm just getting started on TikTok, so I don't have very many followers there yet, but it was kind of fun to give that a try. But this morning, I actually sent out an email announcing this to my email list. And I tell you, 18 minutes after I sent out my email, the first submission came in, and a bunch more have come in since then. So I can tell this is going to be big, and it's because sadly there's a big need. I mean, it's why you guys are listening, because people are looking for tips and resources, information, advice, and widowed parenting is hard. So if you think you have a tip to share, head on over to my website. So it's jennylisk.com/52tips. That's the number 52 tips. If you just head to my homepage, you can also find a link off there as well. And there's a simple Google form on there. You can submit your idea, and I'm going to be selecting 52 tips, so one per week. And the idea is to have a book full of information that would be really relevant and really useful to help people get through that first year, one tip per week. And something that's very accessible, quick format. I'm just looking for short, not whole essays, like 100-word tips. So please do think about submitting something. Like I said, the submissions are open until February 15th, and that's 2022. If you happen to be listening to this later, that is when this is going on. So I hope you will submit something. All right, hey, let's get on to today's show. My guest today is Heather Stang. Heather is the author of Mindfulness and Grief and the forthcoming guided journal From Grief to Peace. She's the founder of the Mindfulness and Grief Institute and the host of the Mindfulness and Grief Podcast. Heather holds a master's degree in thanatology and is also a certified yoga therapist. She's joining us today from Maryland. Heather, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm really grateful to be on the Widowed Parent podcast. And this isn't our first conversation, so I'm excited to get to talk to you again.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this. And I'll just let listeners know that I was on your show recently. I think it just aired in April of 2021, if you're listening later. I think it was episode 44 of the Mindfulness and Mindfulness and Grief podcast. We had such a great discussion. I was re-listening to it the other day, so I would encourage listeners to go and check that out. In fact, I'll put a link in the show notes. Because in addition to all the regular wonderful topics, we got into this discussion about intuitive grievers and instrumental grievers in this book that both of us are familiar with called Grieving Beyond Gender, which is a really fascinating topic. And I think we had a great discussion about that on your show.
I agree. And I think most of us who are podcast consumers can't listen to enough podcasts. So there's hopefully room on everybody's plate for one more grief podcast.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, and so this is great today because I've really been excited about bringing your knowledge, particularly on this topic of mindfulness and grief, to my listeners here today. So let's just jump right in. Let's just, I was looking at your new guided journal. So again, you have a book and then, and I'll ask you about both of them later, but a new guided journal. The very first sentence, you say, and I quote here, "There's no shortage of people eager to tell you how to cope with grief and loss. However, only one person can honestly know what you need. You." I think that might surprise people because most of us are not grief experts going into this, and we might think we don't know what we need or we're lost or whatever. So can you tell us about this?
I think in the world of thanatology, which is the study of death, dying, and bereavement, one of the things...
Oh, thank you for defining that. Sorry, yeah. Because I did mention in the beginning, that you're a thanatologist.
And that's like one of those words, right? Like, what is that?
Right. Who's ever heard of that word until you get... So tell us again, it's the study of what?
The study of death, dying, and bereavement.
Okay.
And I think the one thing we can all in that field agree on is that each person has their own experience of grief. And while we have some best practices, and there's research that shows what can help, and there's research and common sense around what might not help, that at the end of the day, no one knows what's going on inside your head but you. And it's helpful to have guidance. It's helpful to have best practices. It's helpful to maybe spend some time with peers or people who have been through it, which is why you offer such a wonderful service that I wish you did not need to offer. I wish you hadn't had to go through this. I wish the listeners weren't having to go through this. We can get a lot from our peers. We can get a lot from experts, but we can also be told we should do something or we need to do something or we have to do something that internally we know just isn't what we need. But it can also be really hard to know what you need when you're in the early days of grief, right?
Yeah.
And by days, I could use that as weeks or months or even years. I use that time loosely.
Sure.
And so...
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no. So, I wanted to start that out. And that is a pretty bold statement to open the book with.
Yeah.
But my intention for the guided journal, this is a book that I sort of wrote. It's got a lot of blank lines in it. And you, the reader, who I'm actually going to call a writer, is writing most of the book, but it helps to have some guidance on, with prompts and questions and practices and exercises and a little bit of information on, things that might help. But to listen to yourself, because at the end of the day, at 3 a.m., who you got?
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. So if somebody is sitting here thinking, well, okay, I want to listen to myself, but myself is saying, I don't know. Right? Like, what do you do?
Well, that's where the guided prompts help. The guide. So I like to think of it, and this might be a little silly, but since we're talking to widowed parents, many of you might be able to think of a time when you were in a bowling alley with a small child for the first time, and they put up those bumpers in the gutters, right? And that it doesn't roll the ball for the child, but it does give them some guidance, and I kind of think that's what a guided journal does, is it asks you questions. It invites you to write down some memories, to look at a picture in a different way than maybe you would have before. And through going through those exercises, you start to rewrite your own narrative. And one of the things that the grief research shows is what we're doing is we're kind of picking up the pieces, the shattered pieces of our life, and figuring out how are we going to reform them so that we can continue forward.
Okay, wait, let's say that again. Picking up, can you say that again? I think that was a very important point.
Okay. Picking up the shattered pieces of our lives and reforming it so we can move forward. Which sometimes, there's some pieces you don't get to pick up. Let's be honest. That's the hardest part of grief, is missing our person. Right. And we can't change that. We can't change the physical part of that. Right. What we can do is incorporate the memories of that person and the imprint that they had on our life, while also discovering who we are and who we want to be in the world. That's not an easy task.
No.
But it's what we are doing through our mourning process. And if you're early on, by the way, I want to back up a little, because the first section, the first couple sections of the book, really, of both of my books, because they both follow the same 8-step mindfulness and grief system that I developed. They mirror each other. One is text and the other is a journal, and they go together well. They can also be used on their own. But if you are in what we would call acute grief, where you're crying a lot, you're overwhelmed, you're foggy, you're forgetful, you feel really, really heartbroken, the first step is to take care of yourself. Before you get into that, picking up the pieces and reforming your life and deciding who you're going to be now.
If you try to get to that too soon, it might either be impossible or something else.
I think of it as maddening. Like, it would just be like, I don't even know that I've witnessed too many people who've tried to get there too soon, because you're just so exhausted.
So, okay, so you mentioned, did you call it an 8-step mindfulness and grief process?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to hear more about that. And you said that's kind of the backbone of the book and the journal. Yeah,
it's like the backbone of everything I do.
Okay.
And I think a lot of that comes out of my training as a mindfulness teacher and a yoga therapist. And so really when we look at this system or process I've created, first, I like to say I didn't invent mindfulness and grief. The people who did that have been dead for thousands of years. These are ancient practices.
Okay.
What I did is I took those ancient practices of yoga and mindfulness and meditation and compassion practices, And I looked for the intersection of those with contemporary thanatology,
Contemporary grief theory.
contemporary grief theory.
Okay.
And I actually didn't seek out to do this, by the way. This circles back to, we were talking about Grieving Beyond Gender. And one of the authors of that book is Dr. Terry Martin, who was my teacher, my professor in my thanatology program. See, this all
How
related.
Interesting. So did you get to read his book in your class then?
It was, I think, an optional textbook, if I recall correctly, but I did read it. You always want to read your professor's work, right?
Yeah, of course.
But there was one day in class, and I don't remember what the class was. It was like a basic kind of, this is what grief is class, looking at the different principles of grief and the different models that different people have written over time. And one of the things we were talking about were the physical symptoms of grief. I think that's something that surprises people who haven't gone through grief before, is just how physical the experience is.
Tell us a little more about that.
Well, probably many people listening can think of where you feel grief in your body, and it's different for different people. Some people feel a hollowness in their stomach or that ache in your heart. Some people experience insomnia, muscle tension, nausea, joints that ache. There's a lot of physical manifestations of grief. And in class, Dr. Martin was listing these off. And I'm sitting there as a certified yoga therapist, and I'm thinking, oh, that's why I'm here. Like it hit me because I wasn't really even sure why I was getting a master's in thanatology, except for that. Like I was doing suicide intervention at the time, and I think I thought I was going to go off and I worked on the suicide hotline in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. As a volunteer, I flew down there for a short period of time, and I think I thought I was going to do that type of work.
And so thanatology might be helpful for that.
Yeah, for that. But that day, it all changed. Like that day, I realized that my direction in life was to take my love of yoga and meditation and help people who are grieving deal with the thing that we probably are more capable of dealing with when compared to the heartache, I'll say, of grief. Like it's a lot easier to take care of your physical body by giving it water and nutrition and good sleep and some movement and maybe some aromatherapy, maybe some meditation and some stretching. It's a lot easier to do that than to say, how are you going to continue living your life in the early days? Do you see what I'm saying? Like there's a process here.
Interesting. I never thought of it that way.
It's all about the stress response of grief because we can work with the stress response, at least short term in little blips, we can work with the anxiety of grief. And once you can feel like, I think many people, and I think this is probably really true for people who've lost a partner or a spouse, like everything changes, right?
For sure.
Everything. Yeah. And you have very little control over all the changes. And so these practices give you something you can control.
The practices meaning the physical things you were just talking about.
Physical things that you're doing.
Supporting your body and healthy, the water and the stretching and the different things you mentioned to support your body.
Yeah, the healthy habits. And so, we were talking about the 8-step system. And so I'll admit this here. I admit this in a lot of places. In the book, in the journal, the first chapter is mindful awareness. But when I teach my system, I actually teach that second. And that was an editorial choice back in 2014 that I did not win that battle. I always teach conscious relaxation first. My goal when I work with people who are grieving, who are in acute grief, is to get them back to sleep. Because if you're not sleeping, all those emotions are going to be, the volume's going to be turned up on them. I'm not saying it's not hard. I'm not saying that, we just have to turn down the volume. I'm not saying that at all. You know,
Right.
I'm a bereaved person myself. I know what it's like.
Right.
But I'm saying that we can at least help your biology.
And are you saying maybe that if you're not sleeping, everything's just going to get worse and harder?
Well, think about a time in college when you stayed up till 4 a.m. either partying or studying. How were you the next day?
Yeah, finishing some
that's
term paper or something.
Yeah. I mean, sleep deprivation, whether you're grieving or not, does not help things. It makes things way worse. I mean, you know, not to be dramatic, but there's a reason why sleep deprivation is used for torture. You know, it's a tool that makes people unsteady, shaky, and it can be detrimental to your health too. And that's another thing that came up during that class that really struck me is just the, you know, in the first 6 months to a year of grief, it's a lot more likely that you're going to get sick or injured or possibly even die. And so why is that? Well, you know, one is the heartbreak might be it. And I don't know that anyone's really studied deeply the why, but I think part of it is if we're sleep deprived, we're distracted. So another thing I always tell my early grievers, and you all listen to this, drive safely, like, you know, take care of yourself, pay attention, because you're not as focused when you're grieving. So, you know, I want to help people be healthy. And, you know, because when you're sick and grieving, that's insult to injury. But there's a lot we can do to just help our body like absorb the shock of it all.
So does yoga then potentially come into play as something helpful with this aspect? How does that work? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, yoga or meditation, if people aren't comfortable doing something like yoga or movement, you know, any type of body movement can be helpful for depression and stress. So it depends on who I'm working with, what I'll say flavor of technique we use. But I always want to help people get back in their body. And so some people that might be yoga, it might be gentle stretching, or if they have something they already do that they love. Because if we go back to that like my opening statement, there's only one person that knows what you need. You know, I'm not going to go to someone and say, oh, you have to do what I'm offering.
You have to do yoga.
You have to do yoga. You have to meditate.
The answer for everybody.
Right. And yeah, they do help. And there's been some research that's popped up even just in 2021 on the neurobiology of mindfulness and grief and how it can help, which is really cool. But I want to work with what people have. And so I've had a couple people come through my program who were avid swimmers. And so their meditation was getting back in the pool and swimming and using that, bringing mindfulness to that and doing deep relaxation before bed, not just with those two people, but everybody, you know, finding some good sleep hygiene tips. You know, that can help a lot. But I also get a lot of people who say, I've been interested in this meditation thing. I just never did it. But now that my entire world is fallen apart, I'm looking for something to help.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So, and just, you know, terminology, definitions. What are we talking about? We've mentioned mindfulness. We've mentioned meditation. We've mentioned a bunch of things. So are those the same? Are they different? Are they subsets of each other? How do they fit together?
I'm so glad you asked. This is like one of my favorite questions to be asked. I start out a lot of talks because the words mindfulness and meditation get tossed around a lot. What are they? Are they the same? So I think of mindfulness can be defined many different ways. Mindfulness is a state of mind. This is the first definition. It's a state of mind where you are present and awake and aware of what's going on right now. And you're not just present, awake, and aware, you're actually aware that you're aware. So it's like this, you know,
that's kind of meta.
It's very meta. It's a meta awareness or metacognition. Like I am here and I am mindful, right? It's this, right? So it's state of mind. The second thing mindfulness is used for is a specific type of meditation, a style of meditation, if you will, and I'll define meditation in a moment, where you are cultivating that meta awareness, and you're using an awareness of your senses, sight, smell, sound, taste, touch, and an awareness of thoughts to be in the present as often as you can. Nobody needs you to be perfect for this to work. That's what's great, because having a human brain and having a grieving human brain, it's really hard to stay in the present for more than a microsecond. Like, it's a victory to just be present for a moment. And then the third definition, and this comes from kind of, I guess it's almost an accidental definition, if that's fair. It's often used as a broad umbrella term for Buddhist teachings. And that kind of comes out of Jon Kabat-Zinn's work, who brought mindfulness into the healthcare system back around 1980, and he's kind of considered the father of modern mindfulness.
Okay.
He created the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which is evidence-based and is it's a practice, it's a program, it's an 8-week program that's used in hospitals and to help people. Initially, it was to help people who had fallen through the cracks of the healthcare system, so to speak, who could not be fixed by a treatment or a surgery. They were sent to Dr. Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction clinic by the hospital to amazing effects, right? This is where all the research started in America on mindfulness. Like, it's the root. And I was reading a beautiful article he wrote where he was reflecting on that time period, like, here we are now, and there we were then. And now you see mindfulness magazines, like on every checkout aisle at a grocery store, there's a Time magazine with mindfulness on the cover. Whereas back in 1980, no one knew what it was.
40 years ago.
Oh, whoa, don't mention that. That just
that makes me feel old, yes.
Yeah. But you're right. It was.
Yeah.
So he was talking about choosing his words when he was creating what we now refer to as MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And he didn't want to use a lot of Buddhist language that might not work in a hospital system in the 1980s.
Okay. That they might just refuse to.
It might just scare people off. It might just make people uncomfortable. As a Phoenix Rising yoga therapist, that's the lineage I'm out of. We were taught not to use jargon, which is why I'm glad we're defining this. Like, you don't try to confuse your students with Sanskrit words. You don't even name poses in our tradition. You just do them, which is kind of neat. Because then it's not like setting up some ideal image of what something should look like.
Makes it more accessible.
It's way more accessible. And so anyway, in this article, Jon Kabat-Zinn was just reflecting on this word mindfulness. And he was saying how, it was probably kind of how he was using it, that we think of this broad umbrella of mindfulness term when we're thinking of Buddhist techniques. And these are the things I use. And so when I talk about mindfulness and grief, I'm probably in this camp where I'm thinking of it as a collection of tools that help liberate people from suffering.
A collection of tools that help liberate people from suffering. That's a pretty big statement.
It really is. But that's the goal. That's the goal. And it doesn't, and maybe we could take a moment before we go into what meditation is and just define pain and suffering.
Okay.
In this realm, and how people choose words is up to them. But in Buddhism and in meditation training and mindfulness training and MBSR and the mindfulness and grief system, the pain is real. The grief is real. There's no denying that. We're not pretending that doesn't exist.
Mhm.
The suffering are all of the add-ons, the worries and the fears that aren't ever going to happen. So I'm going to give you a visual. I'm going to speak you through a visual. One of my favorite definitions of mindfulness isn't actually a words, it's a picture, and it's on the internet. Many of you may have seen it, and no one seems to know who created this. So if anyone knows who created it, call me. Spend a lot of time reaching out to other professionals who have it on their site. Did you make this? No, do you know? So it's a picture of a person and a dog looking off at a landscape, and you see two trees and the sun, the sunshine.
Okay.
And over the dog is a thought bubble with two trees in the sun. And over the human is a thought bubble. The trees and the sun are not in there. There's a car honking its horn. There's bills. There's dirty socks. There's someone screaming. There's telephones ringing. And that picture right there, I think, sums up what that mind state of mindfulness is. But all those add-ons up in the human's thought bubble, like that's where the suffering can come from.
So is the lesson that we should all wish to be dogs?
We should all wish to be dogs. You know, this is why my volunteer thing that I do is I transport rescue dogs.
Nice.
Because just being around dogs, that helps you be mindful.
Yeah. Well, dogs are very much, in the moment, right? I mean, that's how they live.
Except for at dinner time, right? Then they become, then they're looking at an empty bowl, but they see the dog food in it in their thought bubble overhead. They are very present.
What I'm hearing, I think, is that the pain and the grief are there and are real and are significant, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're saying that all those other things that a person then might, in their mind, add into the situation, are you saying those are optional? Well,
I'd stop short of saying optional, because as someone with a human mind, I know we can't always choose what we think.
Okay, yeah.
So I want to wrap this in a lot of self-compassion and a lot of spaciousness.
Right.
I'm saying that there are often things that we are focused on that if we could stop focusing on them, we'd be a lot less stressed out and worried.
Mm.
One of the most common things I see with people who are grieving, myself included, is the feeling bad about feeling bad.
Feeling bad about
like
feeling
instead
bad.
of just being like, I'm grieving, I hear a lot of people come to me, and this breaks my heart for them, and yet I totally understand it, where they're like, my husband died 2 months ago, which immediately in my head is, wow, that's really recent. Like that's my thought bubble.
Sure.
Just to give it context. And then they're like, and I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I'm not getting it together. That's an add-on that's causing them more suffering, is that self-blames and shame and feeling like I need to be other than how I am now.
Feeling like they're doing something wrong, or something's wrong with them.
Yes.
Right. Gotcha.
And, and I understand that. And especially if you have kids, I know there's sometimes you just have to be a parent, right? Even though it's, you're exhausted, you're tired, you're grieving. But this is another one of those mindfulness umbrella tools, is self-compassion. Like that's a big part of mindfulness, is self-compassion, or compassion for other people too. And so that's where, if we're getting back to my 8 steps, that's number 3. First, we relax the body. Then with conscious relaxation, then we learn what mindfulness is and just kind of track, when are we mindful? When aren't we? Can I spend more time in the present? Are there some small add-ons that I can release, that I can let go of, that are going to reduce my anxiety or help me be present or help me get a little more closer to what I need? And then we come into the compassion and self-compassion. And that is the transformation, is when we can learn to be kind to ourselves when we're going through something hard. To me, in my experience working with humans and dogs, but humans, so much can free up when we stop being hard on ourselves.
Mm. Mm. Makes sense. Yeah. So that's step 3.
Mm-hmm. That is step 3.
And where do we go from there?
Well, first, let's back up to that word meditation, because I don't think I
Yes.
defined that, and we want to make sure we're jargon-free here.
That. Right.
So meditation is like exercise. Exercise is this big word. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can exercise. You can figure skate. You can walk around the block. You can play basketball. You can do yoga. And when you exercise, you are making your body strong and resilient so that you can live your life with more ease, so that you can pick up a load of groceries out of the trunk and carry them up the stairs, so you can lift up your baby, so that you can go out and do the things you want to do in life. Mm-hmm. Meditation is also a big umbrella term. There are a whole bunch of practices that fall under that umbrella, such as mindfulness meditation, compassion meditation, mantra meditation, where you focus on a word over and over again. I put prayer under that because there's certain types of prayer that are a meditation. And when you meditate, you are making your brain strong and resilient so that you can move through your day and be less reactive and be more kind and more gentle and more in tune with what's happening and have an ability to actually savor moments and an ability to know what you need to.
You mentioned less reactive. So that reminds me, a line I pulled out of your book here. You said, quote, no matter what happens, if you learn to be mindful of your experience, you can learn to respond rather than react.
Yes.
So what's the difference, and why is it important to understand or think about that?
So reaction is done without thought. It might be screaming at someone. It might be punching someone. It might be picking up the bottle and pouring your third or fourth glass when you know only one or two is what you can handle. Where you're not thinking, you're on autopilot. And one of my favorite quotes from Sharon Salzberg, who's another great meditation teacher, is, we want to learn to respond with compassion rather than, 15 consequential actions later. Because we could probably all think back to a time in our life where we just weren't really thinking through. We were just reacting and things didn't turn out so well. And so responding implies choice. And one of the fascinating things about mindfulness and neuroscience is when you practice mindfulness regularly, your amygdala, which is that emotion center in the brain, it's where your reactivity is. It's also what allows you to jump out of the way of a moving car. It actually shrinks physically, gets smaller.
When you practice?
Mindfulness.
So then you're less likely to react to things in the future and more likely to
respond,
meaning to include thought behind whatever you do next, as opposed to jumping right to it on autopilot.
Exactly.
It
also, here's more there, but wait, there's more. And I won't go through the whole brain because, number one, I'm not an expert on all the areas and I'd say something wrong, but I can give people a resource, and I know you love resources. Buddha's Brain. Buddha's Brain's a great book if you're interested in the neuroscience behind mindfulness. And it's actually an easy read for something it's fun. It's a fun read.
Yeah.
But so your prefrontal cortex, the front of your brain where your executive functioning is, where decision making happens, that gets bigger. So there's a lot of trade-offs that happen. Your creativity center also gets bigger, which helps you problem solve in a different way. There's all these things that change, that get rewired in your brain. So it's not even that you're thinking, oh, I need to react slower. You
just kind of naturally do.
Yeah. You get a little more steady.
So, okay. And so these things, which all sound good, you say, if you practice mindfulness, these could be some benefits. So what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Practice mindfulness. How, like, somebody's listening thinking, great, I want, to develop that. What do I do? What does this mean?
It's a great question. Okay, so I'm going to give you the uncomfortable first answer, which is no one really knows how much time you have to do it, because most of the studies are done in like 20 minutes of meditation a day. I don't think anyone's done a study on 5 minutes of meditation a day. So if someone says you must do this, and that's what you have to do, we don't know. But we do know that there are a lot of studies using 20 minutes a day that show positive benefits. I've had clients come to me who are like, I can only do 5 minutes a day. And actually, that's where I start with people in my program. I'm like, start with 5 minutes a day. 5 minutes a day can change your life for some people.
Huh.
Because you're you're developing a habit, a behavior where you're saying, I'm going to spend 5 minutes changing how I'm relating to the present moment. And that can have a trickle down effect. And I'll tell you, like, what do I mean by that? What are you doing in those 5 minutes?
You can see me thinking here, like, what does she mean, right?
Well, it's also like a good question that I know I need to answer. So in the structure of what I teach, it's kind of an ancient structure. It's how a lot of meditation teachers teach. So first you learn to relax. So with my beginning students, for the first week or month, it's going to depend on them. It's going to depend on how traumatic was their loss, how intense is their anxiety. One of my biggest regrets is that my first book, I put it as week 1, week 2, week 3, because that's how John Kabat-Zinn's program is. That's how everybody did an 8-week program, because that's how how meditation was taught in centers and things. Gotcha. And now I call things modules.
because it could, for any given individual, it could be more or less time.
Right. So the first section, the type of meditation practice, and we call it a practice because there's no performance, by the way, people. Like, you're never going to get tested on it. You just go out and you do it and you do it and you do it.
Okay.
And I usually will have people do 5 minutes of a focusing type of meditation, which might be starting with the number 10. And each time you exhale, you silently count down to 1 on each breath. So each time you exhale out, 10, then 9, then 8, not like 10, 9, 8, 7, 8. When I was a younger teacher, I made that mistake of not clarifying that, and people were really trying to rush their counting. But just all you're doing is focusing on counting. That's all you do. And what happens in the brain when you do that type of focus is it switches off the stress response. And that's where a lot of our anxiety is coming from. There are other techniques too. You can find a word or a short phrase that you repeat over and over again. And the key with all of these teachings, and if there was only one thing I could give anyone who is learning how to meditate, because sometimes this gets missed, the most important thing for you to know is that when you wander off or drift away or forget that you're meditating and you're off in a daydream or you're time traveling to the past or future, every time you start over, you just notice you've wandered off and you go, oh, I got to come back to my number. I'm going to count down. When you bring your attention back, that is rewiring your brain. So there's nothing bad or wrong about drifting off, as long as you just keep bringing yourself back.
You don't have to beat yourself up that you're failing at meditating.
You're not failing at meditating. And I often say there's not good or bad meditators. There are people who meditate and there are people who don't, and that's it. So this is a fertile ground for practicing self-compassion, especially if you're grieving. Because let me tell you, when my stepfather died, this was 12 years ago. I had already written the book proposal for Mindfulness and Grief. I was already teaching this. I was in my senior year of my thanatology program. Senior year, do you do that semester? The last semester. which, by the way, I didn't even know I graduated. That's what grief does to you. Like it was the whole thing where a year later they were like, here's your diploma. And I'm like, what? I was going to sign up for classes. That's a whole funny story now. But when Tom died, it was traumatic. I saw him as they were trying to resuscitate him. And I definitely had a trauma reaction. I didn't do sit down, meditate for 3 months. I couldn't because I was having trauma. And it's important to know that sometimes trauma and meditation can work together and they cannot work together. Another great book for you guys, Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness by David Truleven. If you are a grief professional or if you're someone who wants to meditate, who has had a traumatic loss where you have flashbacks or intrusive images, it's a great book to read.
Okay, I'll put that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. Because when I sat down to meditate, I'd have flashbacks. It wasn't good in my body. So what I did is, and remember I talked about working with where people are. I had to do that for myself. I took that idea of focus and repetition that we do in conscious relaxation to the tennis court, and I started hitting a ball against a wall. And my focus stayed on that ball. And that gave me that physical activity that released the trauma. It also gave me the focus that I needed to give myself a break.
You're focusing on that ball in that moment, hitting the wall, hitting your racket, hitting the wall, hitting your racket.
That's it. That's all I did. It was pretty wild how that shifted things. So we're asking about practice, and I'm taking us down to learning tennis, but anyway.
No, this is great.
Use what works for you. So conscious relaxation, you get there by repetition and focus. Then mindful awareness. That's the mindfulness meditation. So that might be 5 or 10 minutes if someone's ready to go up, or 15 minutes where you just sit and pay attention to your senses. And you bring your attention back to the present over and over again.
Your senses meaning, what am I hearing in the environment? What am I smelling something? What am I feeling as I sit here?
Yep,
that kind of
all
stuff.
that. Yeah, just whatever naturally arises. So it's not even that you're seeking it out. I think that's another thing that gets missed in training is people think they need to what am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I feeling? And they're seekers, they're looking. But I think of it as you're receiving the information in your body. You're receiving the sound. So I use the image of a giant satellite dish, just sitting out there in the field and things are bouncing off of it. It's not going out looking for anything. And you don't even have to process it. You don't have to be the computer that analyzes what the sound waves are. You're just
noticing.
You're just hearing.
Yeah.
Not even thinking or analyzing or interpreting. That's actually the hardest part, I think, is not making up a story about what you're experiencing in the moment.
Yeah. So can walking be a form of meditation?
Absolutely. It can be a form of meditation in many different ways. You can do informal walking meditation where you're just walking down the hall or walking around your neighborhood and you're using that sensation in your feet to ground you to the present. There's also a mindfulness in motion type of walking meditation where you actually walk really slow. So slow, a lot of people clasp their hands behind their back for balance because you're going so slow you feel like you're going to fall forward. And you just lift your foot, you place it, you lower, you lift, you place, you lower. I have one client who came up with this great idea to go for a walk and practice compassion meditation while she walked. And so she would actually repeat, and we haven't talked a lot about compassion meditation, but she would walk, which helped her body process some of that anxiety and trauma. And she would connect to feelings of compassion for all being, which helps reduce anxiety and fear and loneliness. So yeah, walking, running, bicycling, knitting, any of that, as long as you're bringing the right type of attention to it.
Interesting. I'm thinking about how I haven't done this as much lately because I have actually a foot injury, but I used to go, I have dogs, right? So I could walk with the dogs or without the dogs. And it's interesting because I would find if I walked without the dogs, there's a certain pace that I'd fall into that my legs would then just start going and like in an almost a repetitive, meditative, like of course, maybe this is the opposite because then I wouldn't notice my legs. But I guess my point is if I brought the dogs, they would distract me from, it was almost like, I could be more, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. The dogs want to stop and they want to pee and they want to bark at the other dogs. And right, that would distract me from falling into a kind of a meditative walk.
Right. Well, I think also it does make sense. And I actually was kind of thinking, since we are on the Widowed Parent podcast, dogs, when you're walking them, they require some care.
Right.
Just like children require care.
Right. You have to make sure they're not getting into trouble and pooping in the wrong place and you're picking it up and right.
Right. And so I can see where it might be beneficial. Maybe. It depends, because some people, the walking the dog is going to be their meditation, but to have a period of time where you're not having to take care of anyone, even the dog.
Yeah. Right.
Because then your experience is more inward. Because that's kind of what I get. Like maybe you weren't in tune with your feet, but you were having some type of, I don't know if it was more of a trance, like a self-hypnosis type of experience or something, but you were experiencing something.
Right. And the dogs would pull me away from that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you can use the dogs as a bell of awareness to pull you out of, if you're in trance or fantasy or future, that, having that animal, you could be like, okay, you can practice mindfulness while your dog is doing their business. In fact, one of my favorite class stories was one of the homework assignments I give people is to pick, and the listeners can do this, is to pick a task you do every day that's rather mundane and doesn't take up a lot of time. And, it could be like brushing your teeth or pouring your first cup of coffee. And during the first week, you just focus on it. During the second week, you bring mindful awareness to it. During the third week, you cultivate compassion or self-compassion while you do it. And I've only had one person choose this without knowing this story. A woman picked scooping her cat litter. And I was just like, oh boy, this could go sideways real quick, but it worked, and by week 3 in the compassion, she was just like, I no longer view scooping the litter as a gross chore, but it's an act of service to animals I love.
Oh, yeah.
It's beautiful.
Uh-huh.
And meanwhile, people are still getting a lot out of pouring their coffee or, just because it's training their brain and, but that one stuck with me.
Right. Yeah. Gosh, I'm just noticing, I think we could keep talking about this all afternoon here.
I was just looking at the clock. I was like, oh.
Yeah, or all evening, I guess, in your time zone. Let's see. Well, what haven't we covered yet? I've got all kinds of notes here, but we're not going to be able to get to all these. What are some of the most important things maybe that you think we haven't gotten to yet?
So I think since we're kind of talking a lot about mindfulness and meditation practice, we'll keep kind of going with that.
Okay.
The other important thing I want to share with people is, I talked about practice. We call that formal practice. That means you're setting a certain time period, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, depending on who you are and what you want to do. Mm-hmm. And you're saying, during this time, this is what I'm doing. But then there are moments, what we call informal practice, where you are out walking the dog and you recognize you've been maybe going down your to-do list while you're walking, and you make a choice like, oh, I want to take a mindful awareness break and just notice I'm here now in the present, walking my dogs. I see these trees, I'm smelling the oak in the air, whatever it is. That's informal mindfulness. And both of those are important. You weave those through the day. So I think that, along with the being kind to yourself when you get distracted, those are good things to know.
Mm-hmm. And so for people who really want to try meditating, but they think they're going to be quote unquote bad at it, even though you said there's no bad meditators, or they are having trouble getting started, or they're finding it hard in some way, do you have some advice for them?
Yes. Start with a guided meditation. In fact, some people, that's all they do. So that's having someone like me recorded guiding you through the practice. Self-guided meditation where you sit down with a quiet 5 minutes and take yourself through it. That is great. It's something to maybe aspire to down the road, but it's really, really hard in the beginning. And again, especially with the grieving brain, because the grieving brain is so different. Although even non-grieving brains are very distracted very easily. It's how we're wired as humans. So guided meditations. I have a page on my website at Mindfulness and Grief. The page is called Meditation for Grief. It's right up there in the top bar. It'll walk you through not just those first few steps I gave you, but the other steps. In the first three, or actually the first 4 steps are real classic mindfulness training. Conscious relaxation, mindful awareness, compassion. And then the 4th one is working with difficult emotions, because when you sit in those 5 minutes, it doesn't just mean it's going to be all peaceful, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
Especially if you've just had some really bad news.
Right.
So there's specific meditation techniques to not avoid and not to pour fuel on the fire of a difficult emotion, but to actually tend to it. That's a whole other podcast right there.
Well, maybe we'll have to talk about that another time.
But, and that's why we're doing all this. If we get to why, like, why just sit and do nothing? What's the point? I mean, at the end of the day, if we go back to that big, bold statement I made at the beginning, it's to help alleviate suffering. And the boring moments aren't usually where you're suffering. It's where the big emotions show up and smack you in the face, which we know happens in the grocery store or in meditation. The last 4 pieces are skillful courage, getting unstuck, meaning reconstruction, and allowing transformation, and perpetual mindfulness. Skillful courage is actually the difficult emotions. Forgive me. I barely know my own thing that I've been doing since 2014.
I'm sure that's not true.
That's not true. So getting unstuck is about getting to know your mental habits, like your own personal mental habits, and how to not get hooked by them. And then meaning reconstruction goes to that. It goes to memory making and honoring your loved one, and also figuring out who you are now, which also flows over into allowing transformation, which is really about you.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So much more to talk about.
So much. But I think those first ones, are really, those are the things that can lead to the transformation. Those are the foundations of any meditation training. And I think that they really help for grief. I know, gotcha. I don't just think I know.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned that your website has, you mentioned this, what is it, the list of things?
Yeah, it has actual guided meditations on there, so people can get started tonight, right now. You can go over and stream something and, start with the conscious relaxation, see how it fits.
Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. I'll put a link for sure in the show notes to that. And I think you also you do some one-on-one work. You have a group-based course as well. I think the details are on your website, as well as, of course, your podcast.
Right.
And I think I saw you have a retreat of some sort coming up as well.
I do. Assuming things keep going in the direction they're going pandemic-wise.
Yeah.
Omega Institute is having a grief retreat in October, and I believe it's October 1st through 3rd
of 2021.
2021. Yeah, we should say that. It'll be my first in-person gig in a long time.
Yeah.
It's up in Rhinebeck, New York, upstate.
Okay.
I think it's technically upstate. I should double check that. I'm not so familiar with New York
Well, of course, to New York City
geography.
people, everything outside the city is upstate. So
Yeah, that's probably true.
I think you're pretty
All right,
safe.
well, there we go. So we're going to do movement. We're going to do journaling. There's going to be grief rituals. It's going to be fantastic. So that's October 1st through 3rd. And you can find that on my website. There's a button that says grief support that talks about my private sessions, the retreat, and then Awaken, which is my course and group that meets once a week. But there's also a self-guided meditation and grief course in there too.
Okay, so if somebody's listening to this discussion today and they're thinking, this sounds great, but I'm not really sure how to get started, and I'm like, it's piqued my interest, but what do I do next? It sounds like you've got some, of course, your book and your journal as well.
Well, and they all follow the same format, right? So if someone had my book, my journal, and joined Awaken, they're going to have a structure and a process to follow and self-care, as well as that peer support in the group, which I facilitate. So I'm in there. It's, I'm very hands-on with it. Mm-hmm. But, just to circle back quickly to instrumental grievers and intuitive grievers, I created it so that the intuitive grievers who like to talk and share their emotions, they can show up to the group. But instrumental grievers who may not want to join a group and are more processing cognitively and want to learn more about what grief is and what their experience is, they can do the course. And some people do both.
Yeah. Okay. That's true.
All in one package. So you can decide what works for you and dip in and out to different pieces.
Right. Terrific. Okay, good. Well, I'll put the links to all that in the show notes too, so people can go and check that out. I think we've got to wrap up here. We could keep talking an awfully long time about this, but I just want to ask you one more question, if you don't mind. If you could say one thing to widowed parents about mindfulness and grief, what would you say?
I would say that the most important thing you can do for yourself and for your kids is to be gentle with yourself, because you have been through something really, really difficult. Probably the most difficult thing you've ever been through. And this is really hard, and you're doing your best.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's a great place to end. So my guest today is Heather Stang, host of the Mindfulness and Grief Podcast and author of the book Mindfulness and Grief and the guided journal From Grief to Peace. So Heather, where can listeners find you, find your books, find your courses, and all that good information if they'd like to connect?
So most everything is at mindfulnessandgrief.com. You can find the books in your local bookstore or Amazon, wherever you find your books. You can get your podcast wherever you are listening to this podcast right now. And if you are interested in joining me for Awaken, that is at meditationforgrief.com.
Okay, terrific. Well, Heather, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm grateful to get to share this.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Heather Stang as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 109. And remember, you can support the show at buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. And if you do have a moment, please hop over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review and rating on the show. It's actually tremendously helpful in terms of helping other widowed parents find the show and find this resource. And do check out my book, Future Widow, at futurewidowbook.com if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. And you actually can download a free excerpt if you want to check it out first. All right, all for this week. And as always, thank you for listening. And until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.